Alright, so I'm Nicole Mundy, and this is an over-the-phone interview with Wright. I am at my house in Hastings, Nebraska. It is 6 o'clock p.m. on November 21st, and we're going to discuss his experiences during the Vietnam War. We're going to start with some simple biographical questions. First, where were you born?
I was born in Fairland, Oklahoma.
Fairland, Oklahoma. Is that where you grew up?
No, my parents left Oklahoma and moved to California when I was about one, and I was raised entirely in the central San Joaquin Valley of California.
And who were your parents?
My father was Bill Wright. My mother's name was Anna Mae Wright.
And how many siblings do you have?
I have one brother who is 14 months older than me.
Perfect. How would you describe your childhood?
Very traditional for the 1950s. Very conservative, in a small town. Nothing extraordinary. A fairly traditional two-parent family, as was most of our friends. It was the era before television. We never had television when I was growing up. Didn't listen to the radio a whole lot. Listened to ball games. But with two boys in the family, we just kind of entertained each other and did a lot of things together and kept ourselves occupied.
Well, two brothers, since you had a brother, so you guys were two boys. Did you play outside at all, or did you ever play any backyard games? How did that happen?
Well, we was always either taking our bicycles and taking the front wheel off of one and they'll come together. We did a lot of building of wooden go-karts, anything we could pull. In those days, you didn't have any, nothing electronic or anything. And I really don't remember doing hardly anything inside. Being in the central San Joaquin Valley, we never got snow, so you could really play outside for the most part year-round.
That's awesome. I'm going to transition to questions time prior to any awareness of the Vietnam War. What were you doing prior to your awareness of the war beginning?
Probably it was during my college years. During my years in college, the war was just really kind of vamping up, but that was a different era in that there was only 3 television stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and then that was only for an hour each night. So there wasn't this 24-hour news cycle that we live in today. So it was a different era, and the war really wasn't on your mind that much. I do remember, hearing them say each week how many soldiers had been killed. But other than that, we didn't ever live in an area where there was demonstrations or anything like that, and never participated in any. So as far as, aware of the war, we knew there was one going on, but I didn't ever know anyone who was in the war, and so it really didn't affect me personally.
So with it affecting you pretty little at that time in your college years, do you remember a specific moment of what you were doing when you realized they were going to start drafting people to go to Vietnam?
I don't recall and there was the draft during the years that I was in college. And when I got out of college, there was a law that said if you taught school, you could get an occupational deferment. So my brother and I both became teachers to get an occupational deferment. In the second year that I was teaching school, in 1969, they ended the occupational deferments, and 3 months later, I got drafted into the Army.
Even though you did get your occupational deferment, even with that deferment, were you afraid that you were still going to get a draft notice regardless, or were you pretty sure that you were going to stay out of it?
Well, I had confidence I was going to stay out, but President Nixon ended occupational deferments. They went to a lottery system where they chose literally a lottery by birth date. And I was number 51, my birth date was. And the second month that after they had ended occupational deferments, I got drafted.
That's interesting. So can you tell me a little bit about that process from, you talked a little about how you got your deferment, but then you got your draft notice, and then can you explain a little bit about if or when you took your physical to when you went to basic training, and then I believe you moved on to Colorado Springs. Can you just tell me a little bit about that, or what you did through that process?
Hey, my brother and I both went and took physicals while we were in college. Both of us had got notice and went to Kansas City. We went to college in Springfield, Missouri, and we went to Kansas City for physicals. And I remember my brother was told basically he was too slender, too skinny to be drafted. Their exact words, he needed to go home and eat some bananas. And they implied that I was fit to be drafted should that time ever come. Of course, at that point, I wasn't a teacher. And so after college, we both became teachers. We both moved to Flint, Michigan. And I was teaching school there when I got drafted in June of 1970. And I was supposed to report June 4th of 1970, but I was under contract until June 10th. I wrote my draft board in California a letter, told them I was teaching school in Michigan, that I was under contract until June 10th, and I got a nice letter back, said, that's fine, why don't you show up in July. So in July 13th of 1970, I had gone back out to California to visit with my parents. My draft board was in Modesto, California. And so I went into the Army from central San Joaquin Valley of California. They sent me to Fort Ord at Monterey over on south of San Francisco for basic training. Went 8 weeks of basic training. And then I got assigned as a clerk typist. And basically because of my college degree, I was really given an office job. Went to school in the Army for personal specialist. I had a military occupational specialty, we call it MOS, of 71 Hotel, which was personal specialist. And I was sent to Colorado Springs, Colorado, to Fort Carson, where I spent the rest of the time that I was enlisted, and became a levee clerk during really the height of the Vietnam War. And I would interview soldiers to really ship them all over the world. but a vast majority of them was going to Vietnam. I would interview them if there was any reason that we could either eliminate them or delay being shipped to Vietnam. And then I would literally type their orders on a manual typewriter, tell them what day they would leave Fort Carson, how many days leave they would get to go home, and where they would report. Generally, it was either Oakland or Fort Lewis in Washington to be sent to Vietnam. I was in the Army and made good rank because of my college education. I worked in an office with 17 other all draftees. All of us were college educated. And I went home Christmas of 1971 and went out to California to visit with my parents for Christmas. When I got back on January 4th of 72, I had worked in one office for 16 months, and they were surprised to see me and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I work here." They go, "No, you got an early out." And what had happened is when I was drafted in July of 1970, about 8 weeks after I was drafted, and just as I was getting out of basic training, they ended the draft. So I was part of what we call the volunteer army, as we was transitioning from a draft to a volunteer army shortly after I arrived at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. And just about Christmas time of 1971, they gave all of those last group of draftees, which I was part of, they gave us a 6-month early out. So I had spent basically 18 months on active duty. I had achieved the rank of E5, which is a pretty good rank for being in for 18 months. It was career status. It was willing to pay for my move back home. But I had got married while I was in the Army to my sweetheart from back in Michigan. And we chose to stay in Colorado Springs. I taught school there for 3 years before we finally decided to move back to Michigan. So I served on active duty for 18 months. And probably one of the things I'm most proud of is that I am an Army veteran.
That's awesome to hear. What were you feeling when you realized that you got an office job and that you weren't going to be shipped off to be on the front line? What were your emotions or feelings about that?
Nicole, I remember that day as clearly as if it was yesterday. I was sitting in a large group, about 260 other young soldiers. And I was 24 when I was drafted. Most of those young kids were 17 and 18. So I was older, already somewhat bald-headed when I was drafted into the Army. I got treated a little bit differently. I was a squad leader during basic training. And in the 7th week of basic training, we sat down as a group. And they had given us some tests when we first came in. And my brother and I both, were just natural typists. There was just something about it that when I was a freshman in high school, and I took a typing class, I was just a natural, and I had never had a typewriter, nor had my brother, but we both just became excellent typists. This is on an old manual typewriter. I could easily type 65 words a minute almost flawlessly. So when I was drafted, they asked one day, about the second day, maybe the third day I was in the Army, we was having battery of tests, and they said, anybody here know how to type? And there was probably 10 of us out of 300 raised our hands. So they had us take a typing test. And as we were sitting in my 7th week of basic training, sitting on the ground, they would read your name and they would tell you what your MOS, your military occupational specialty, was going to be and where your next assignment was. And as we sat there, the vast majority of them heard their name. They heard 11B, that was lightweight infantrymen. That meant they were going to go to Vietnam, and if they were assigned to stay at Fort Ord for 8 more weeks, what we call AIT, Advanced Individual Training, that meant they were going to stay there for 8 more weeks of warfare training, and then they were going straight to Nam. And I remember tears, not sobs, but just tears flowing down people's face. And they heard their name, they heard 11B, Fort Ord. And when they called my name, and they said 70 Alpha, Fort Carson, that's all they said. And I just said, thank you, Lord. And as soon as they said fall out, I grabbed the first drill sergeant I could find, and I said, what's 70 Alpha? He said, clerk typist. I said, what's Fort Carson? He said, that's Colorado Springs, Colorado. I had never heard of 70 Alpha, and I had never heard of Fort Carson. But I was one happy young man, 24 years old, and I knew that more than likely, at least in the near future, I was not heading to Vietnam. And I was extremely grateful that day.
Dang, that's really reassuring and exciting to hear. Did you understand why the United States was involved in the Vietnam War prior to your involvement?
Well, Nicole, we have always kind of had this notion that we was the policemen of the world. And I think at that time there was great fear of communism, and that the spread of communism would eventually affect us here. And so, I think the general feeling was we need to stop communism wherever it is spreading in order to help preserve peace in the world. And I think that was a mentality that our leaders had at that time. And in all honesty, I don't know that it's significantly different today. We look at what we're doing in, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and we are trying to stop the spread of ISIS before it entangles us in that. So I'm not sure that during that period of time that the mentality of our leaders were any different than it is today. There's a difference for those of us here because during the Vietnam War, there wasn't this 24-hour news cycle. And so it didn't often affect your daily living. Now we live the war every day. You can't turn on the news without seeing something about, the war going on over there and how we're involved in it. We're certainly more aware of what's going on. We didn't have a lot of details, via the news during those days. And now we do. So I don't know that the mentality is any different. I think we are still playing policemen of the world. And I don't think that's all bad. I think there's a lot of places that they don't have the ability to defend themselves or their way of life. and they have looked to us as the leader of the free world to either rid them of dictators that are abusing the people, or trying to protect them from somebody else trying to take over. So we played policemen of the world, and we have for a long time.
Now, that's a perfect thing that you were talking about to ask how, since there was not a 24-hour news cycle like we do have now, and there was little details, how did you learn about or receive information about the war while you were in Colorado Springs?
Basically, you didn't. You know, I lived off. Nettie and my wife and I got married in April of '71, and you know, we got involved in a local church, and you know, I was one of those fortunate ones, extremely blessed. I never had another inspection. I never had another formation. I never got to play war. I never got sent to the field. I had a desk job. I went home every night to my wife. So, you know, it didn't really affect me a whole lot. And yet I lived every day with young men and talked to young men that I sent to the war. But that was almost like a detachment, that it didn't affect me. And it, you know, we never talked about it in the office. Nobody talked about it. We just knew it was happening. But as long as it didn't affect your day-to-day living, it wasn't the primary thing on your mind.
Since you had an office job, you kind of briefly talked about this earlier, but could you walk me through a typical day of yours at work in the office?
I was the middle person between the Pentagon and the individual soldier. So every month, I would get about 1,000 names, and I handled what was called the 3rd Brigade at Fort Carson. And I would get about 1,000 names to send all over the world. My first job was to verify that that particular soldier was still at Fort Carson, and that the Pentagon had what we call levied, or was going to send him overseas, in his primary MOS. In other words, if you were a truck driver, and that was your MOS, but they made a mistake and they was going to send you as a radio signalman, then I could eliminate you from that particular draft. So I had to verify that the soldier was there at Fort Carson, and we had one office that was called Post Locator. So I would go there and look up that soldier's name and see if he was there, and then I would have to check his MOS. And then we have all of the records for the 3rd Brigade in our office. So I would then pull his record. I would see, you know, if he was levied in his proper MOS. And our biggest thing was, you know, some young kid in a hometown in Minnesota or Arkansas or wherever, you know, he had signed up to go to helicopter mechanic school. And then you had to understand the system then. If the Army was obligated to send him to helicopter mechanic school, and that may be for, you know, 12 weeks or 6 months. But after that, then you belong to the Army, and they could do anything they wanted to with you. And so I had to check to make sure what he had signed up for, that the Army fulfilled their obligation. And I had a lot of soldiers that would come in and say, but my recruiter told me such and such. And I would show him this 201 file, and I'd say, they didn't write that down. You know, that's not what this says. And so I would literally then, out of 1,000 names, there may be probably 650 of them still at Fort Carson. There were soldiers that I would have to respond to the Pentagon. We've never heard of this soldier at Fort Carson. I had some, I would say, they went AWOL, 9 months ago. I had some, I would say, you already sent this, soldier to Germany. And I handle from E1 through E6. In the Army, you can go up to E9 and enlisted. I handle E1 through E6, up through staff sergeant. And so they had already sent some of those guys, and we're talking about young men from the ages of 18 up to, men that were in their 50s. If they were in E6, they were a career soldier. And so I would have to bring that soldier in if they were still there. I would notify their company, and they would come down. I would sit down with them. I would inform them they've come down on the levee to go to Okinawa, to Germany, send people to England, Vietnam, wherever. And if they were married and their wife was in her 7th month of pregnancy, I could hold that soldier at Fort Carson until his wife had delivered their child. Then I had to send him overseas. Had some interesting cases. I did that for about 14 months, and then I had a E6 that was directly over me, and he was sent to England, and I got promoted. There was 8 levee clerks that was active in Fort Carson, and I became over all of them, and I just handled all kind of the interesting and problem cases. Probably most interesting one, I had an E6 staff sergeant came down on levee to go to Germany, and I remember he said, Specialist Wright said, you send me anywhere in the world, but I don't think we can go back to Germany. And I asked him, why not? He said, well, he had been to Germany twice, and the last time they were in Germany, his wife had delivered a child while he was in the field. And when they would send you out on bivouac, you might go out for 2 weeks. She had delivered a child at an Army hospital in Germany. They told her the child was stillborn, that they had sent the child back to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And when they got back to the States, the Army had no record of their child. The wife had had a nervous breakdown, and she was under a psychiatric care at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver. And so I verified all of this through the Pentagon, and they go, yeah, that really happened. And he said, my wife is just now beginning to function. And he said, I don't think we can go back to Germany without her having another nervous breakdown. So I pulled some strings with the Pentagon, and I asked him, I said, Sarge, what would you like to do? He said, I would like to stay right here. He said, my wife has some good doctors taking care of her at Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver, and we would like to stay here. And I was able to pull some strings and take him off of the levee to Germany and stay there in Colorado. And so I really had some very unbelievable cases that I got to work with. But I would interview the soldier, determine if they could go. I would then type their orders. I would how many days leave they got, what day they had to report. If they went to Germany, they would go out of Fort Dix in New Jersey. To Vietnam, they went out of Fort Lewis in Washington or Oakland Replacement Station. So I would interview soldiers and type orders, and I enjoyed it. It was a great experience. But again, it was probably not the typical Army experience, but for me, it was what I did, and I did it well, and I enjoyed it. I look back with a lot of pride on my 18 months in the Army.
That's really reassuring to yourself that you look back and you can definitely say you enjoyed it. With the interesting cases that you had, did it affect you at all, ever being quote-unquote the bad guy and having to break news to soldiers, or was that just part of the job that you dealt with?
Well, it was part of the job, and I did not realize, Nicole, the power that I had. But when I got an early out in January of 1972, my wife and I had already decided we were going to stay in Colorado Springs. So I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to buy license plates in Colorado, if you're in the Army, you got them cheaper. You beat all the taxes and stuff. So I went to way on the other side of Fort Carson, which was a post of 26,000 men and women. And I went way over to what we call the Judge Advocate General's office to get an affidavit saying I was in the military. And I walked in, and a young man said, oh, you're Specialist Wright, aren't you? Well, I just kind of grinned because on your Army uniform it has your name. I said, yeah. I said, how do you know that? And he says, you're in charge of levies, aren't you? And I kind of paused, and I said, yeah? How do you know that? He said, everybody knows you. And I kind of grinned, and I was literally taken back. And there was probably 75 people in line. They take me literally by the arm. They walked me behind the counter. They treated me like I was a general. And I kind of chuckled, and I guess I did not realize the power and the influence that I had as the one that could either send them to Vietnam or not. And I literally did have, I had, 40, 50 different things that I had to check for to make sure to send them over. And I enjoyed the job, but I never abused it. Not that I would had I known how much power I had, but they treated me like I was the general of Fort Carson. And when I went over there, I just had a smile on my face, like, wow. And I'm getting out of this thing now. But I truly enjoyed it. And I knew the regs, we call it SOP, Standard Operating Procedure. And every now and then, they would come down with something, and I'd have to go next door and talk to the officers and say, why are you doing this? And they'd always sit down with me and say, well, how should we do this? And since I did it every day and I just knew kind of how the procedures worked, I enjoyed the job I had, and I became really excellent at it. And look back on that time, and Nicole, over the years, and I went and got all the graduate work, master's degree, and ed specialist, both through Eastern Michigan University, and my doctoral work was at Western Michigan University, and I was a high school principal for 20 years, and if somebody says we'd like all the college graduates to stand, that has almost no meaning to me at all. But when they say we'd like all the veterans to stand, I kid you not, to this day, and I'm 70 years old, there's a tingle down my back, and it is with great pride that I get to stand and be recognized as a veteran. It is the one thing I did in life that I'm most proud of, other than the fact that I'm married to my first wife, 45 years. Those are the two things I'm most proud of.
Wow, very prideful. You dealt with a lot of soldiers and their information firsthand. How would you say the soldiers were treated? Do you think they got proper care?
Yes. I was never aware of any situation where I felt they were being abused. I thought, and after I got out, as I've talked to young people in school that I've either taught or had contact with, I've just always made sure they understood that if they were going to enlist in the military, they had to make sure that everything that they were told was written down in their 201 file. If it's written there, the Army lived up to it. They never questioned that. And so I think there were a few cases where I had a young man that would say, but I was told. And I would show them, on their 201 file, that's not written here. And so, you can't hold the Army to it because, your recruiting sergeant didn't write it down. And so there was some of them that maybe got the short end of the stick because everything wasn't written down. But once they got in, they were treated fairly. I never saw a case where anybody was mistreated. Of course, I was never, after basic training, I was always in an office setting. And so I was never in the field, and, we never had to go to the field for, 8 days of bivouac and march and play Army and that. My experience just didn't include that. So I probably didn't have the typical military experience that a lot of other soldiers had.
All right, now, if you could explain the war in one word, what would it be, and can you elaborate on why you chose this word?
What the word war means?
If you could explain the war, the Vietnam War, in one word, like a descriptor, what would it be and why?
Oh, my. Hell. I think those guys literally lived in unbelievable, the jungle, the insects. In Vietnam, the government was spraying DDT on the jungles to kill all of the vines and the foliage. And, we found out later on, I think without question, that caused cancer. I think the living conditions were probably just literally a living hell for those guys that, had to participate in that. And I even watch now, Nicole, and I watch our soldiers going, building to building in Afghanistan. And the fear that has to have, that as soon as you peek around a corner, there's a sniper going to pick you off. And during the Vietnam War, they had the same thing. You're out marching through the jungle, and the Viet Cong are hidden, and all of a sudden, you run into 30 armed Viet Cong that are shooting at you. That has to literally be a living hell on your nerves, the physical stuff that they went through, the heat. I can only imagine. I guess if I was going to describe it in one word, I would imagine a lot of them felt that's where they were, just in a living hell.
Dang, that's ridiculous. What was your own understanding of why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam War?
Oh, the only thing thing you can really guess at this point is that we was trying to curb the spread of communism.
Mm-hmm.
South Vietnam was free. North Vietnam was communist. The North was invading the South. It's like we have in North and South Korea today. If North Korea invaded South Korea, I think we would go there in a split second and try to maintain the democracy that we had in South Korea. That's what we was doing there. We was trying to prohibit the spread of communism in the South Vietnam. I mean, that's why we was there.
Mm-hmm.
I think our leaders at that time, I don't know if they was trying to run a politically correct campaign, but often it did not appear we was there to win. We was there to maintain or whatever. Should have just bombed them back to, kingdom come and be done with it. But then you have collateral damage, you kill a lot of people. And I'm not going to second guess the people that was involved in that, but we was there to try to prohibit the spread of communism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now kind of jumping around just a little bit. As regards to your brother getting drafted in the war, he was able to be deferred in order to teach. How did that affect you, knowing that he was somewhat in the clear of being drafted? Or, was it scary at all for you knowing that he still might get a draft notice either way since he's directly family?
I don't know that we ever thought about it.
Okay.
I'm glad he didn't have to go to war. And he, for whatever reason, he didn't get drafted and I did. I'm thankful for that he didn't have to go. I still think, at that time he was 6'2" and weighed about 115 pounds. And I think he was literally just too slender. We use the word skinny. He was too skinny to even be drafted. And I'm glad he didn't have to go through that experience.
Dang. Do you recall the day your service work in Colorado Springs ended, and what do you remember about it?
Well, to be honest with you, I tried to keep my same job as a civilian because as those of us that were draftees was being eliminated, everything was going volunteer army. So they were taking a lot of our jobs and giving it to civilians. And so I tried to keep my same job as a civilian. I just said, look, I'll just stay here and work. And as a civilian. And they go, no, you have to go to Denver, take the civil service test, pass that, and get appointed, and all that. And I said, nah, I don't want to do that. If you want me to just keep this job, I would. And I said, look, I was drafted out of a teaching job. By law, they had to hire me back. And but I made the decision not to return to Michigan, even though my school district had offered me my job back. I stayed in Colorado Springs since I got out January 16th of 72. I substitute taught that second semester of that school year, and then by the fall of 72, I got a permanent job teaching at Gordon Junior High, which the building is still there, right across the street from the big hotel that we were in last year for the big convention. So the building is still there, but they built a new school since then, but I taught junior high math there for 3 years. I was extremely happy that I was out. I've always been a little independent, and there were times that I would just stand and look out the window while I was in the Army, knowing that I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I belonged to the United States government. I belonged to the U.S. Army. I didn't have the freedom to do what necessarily I wanted to do. And so when January 16th of 72 came around, it was really a freedom day for me that I could kind of resume my life, go back to teaching, and that's what I did, and enjoyed a fabulous 31 years in public education and 16 years at the college level, and retired after nearly 47 years of education.
Taking that
So
sounds...
it was a great day to be free, to be honest with you.
Sounds very reassuring for you. Focusing on the time post-war, you've told me and enlightened me with a lot of different stories. Is there a specific experience other from what you've said from the Vietnam War era that you can't forget, or your most vivid memory, or a story you'd like to share that just sticks out to you?
Oh, I don't have any right off. I remember handling individual soldiers, and some of them were humorous, and the one that's, they had lost their child in Germany. That's probably the one soldier that I felt best about helping. Got another soldier came in. He was, at that time, 20 years and you could retire. And he was, how he had enlisted, he was going to be about 19 years when his enlistment was up, so he was going to have to re-up for one more year. Unfortunately, he came down from Libya to go to Germany. And I told him, well, Sarge, you have to go and re-up now to complete this assignment, or if he was an E6, I said, you can turn this assignment down, but then you're barred from re-enlistment. He says, no. He says, I need to re-up for one more year. I said, then you have to take this assignment. And I think it was, at that time, it was a 3-year assignment. And he said, no, I don't want to re-up for 3 years. I only want to re-up for 1. So he said, who can I talk to? So I said, well, there's a captain next door. That's my immediate supervisor. You can go see him. So he literally walked out the back door, and about 40 seconds later, my phone rang. The captain called me, and he says, hey, Wright, says, I got a soldier here, and he gave me the circumstances. And I said, well, here's his option. He either has to go and re-up and accept this assignment for 3 years, or he can turn it down and he's barred from re-enlistment. So he tells the soldier that. So about 2 months later, here he comes back in. He says, he told me the same thing you did. He didn't realize that I was the one the captain had called, So some of them you just kind of grinned, but that was the rule that they had. So he said, well, you'd have to go re-up, because otherwise you would have been forced out. 19 years, had 0 retirement. So he took an extra assignment to Germany that he really didn't want to. But, there were fun things. My job really didn't have any pressure. I dealt with the individual soldier. I had an E7 Sergeant First Class that was in charge of my office. And he let people know that I did my job. He never knew a single case I was working on. Had no involvement with my day-to-day involvement with individual soldiers or the brigade that I handled. He just said, Wayne handles that, does a good job. We basically leave him alone. And so I have some fond memories. Most of us, in our office, everybody was college educated, and so we didn't have to work real hard to do what we was asked to do. And so it was an enjoyable experience. I never minded going to work because there really wasn't ever any pressure. You just went in, you did your job. We had enough time to do it and do it competently. So I really look back on that entire time period with a smile on my face Even though, I wasn't free, I look back now and if I had to do it all again, I wouldn't change anything.
Looking back, what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
Well, for the United States, I think we look back and say, sometimes being the policeman of the world isn't fun. But if we don't do it, who will? And, that hasn't changed. And, Nicole, that was 45 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we find ourselves in the exact same situation now, where we're trying to stop the spread of ISIS and their terrorist ways, and that really has affected Europe a lot more than us. But if we don't put a stop to them, it'll come here. And so we are again playing policeman of the world. The same reason we did in Vietnam, I'm now doing today. So, what did we learn? Well, we learned that if we don't help other countries out in their time of need, then nobody else is going to help them. And it will eventually affect us. It's not necessarily what we want to do, but it's almost what we have to do.
So you mentioned us playing policemen of the world, and we're in the same situation basically again. Do you think we could have done anything differently during the Vietnam War, even though we still find ourselves close to the same situation?
No. And the reason I say no, is that there's still evil. There was evil then, and we worked hard to stop it. And Nicole, there's still evil today, and we're trying to stop it. And I think there'll be evil next year, and we'll still be there trying to stop it. So that's not going to change. As long as there's evil, there has to be somebody that tries to stop it. And unfortunately, it's fallen on us as the leader of the free world to play that part.
Okay. Once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were some things permanently changed for our country? I know you, as an individual, you talked about how you stayed in Colorado Springs for a little bit and all that, but for our country, did things permanently change in regard specifically to the Vietnam War?
Well, I think we changed, Nicole. I don't think there's any question that the Vietnam War and the dissent that we never saw during World War II. During World War I and World War II, basically the civilian population backed the war and backed us in what we was trying to do. I think, even during the Korean War, we didn't have the demonstrations, and that brought the demonstrations and the burning of the draft cards and the soldiers that defected to Canada so they wouldn't go to war. I think that changed us as a nation. And probably not for the better. I don't know. I wasn't involved in that. I never saw that. But I heard enough about it to know that not everybody's going to always agree with you. I look at the demonstrations now. Simply don't like the way something goes. So, you have mob mentality and go to the streets and they didn't necessarily trash as much as they're doing today, but I think it changed America. And I think there's always been a protest group ready to protest anything that they don't like. I don't know that that's good for assassination. But I think that was the first time that it was done on the scale that it was during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And that's probably a sad commentary, I think, for that era, as we talk about the protest movement that was started during that time period. So did we change as a nation? Yeah. And not only with the protests, not only did we protest the government, but they protested the soldiers coming back. They were spit on, they were looked down on. They were made to be ashamed of the fact that they had represented their country. And so I think there was a change in patriotism at that particular time. Dissipated a little bit during Reagan's era, but now is back in full bloom right now. But it seems like it's very normal today to hate America and hate everything about it, whatever, and that doesn't help us as a nation.
Dang. Well, my next question was actually going to be about homecomings for the soldiers, so I'm really glad you touched on that. That's awesome. Did you make any friendships that continued after the war, especially with the people that you worked with in your office because everyone was college educated, or did any friendships remain?
Unfortunately, no. Once I left, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever been in contact with anyone that I worked with during my time in the Army. And even going through all my pictures, I have only maybe a half a dozen pictures of me while I was in basic training. And I don't think I have any pictures at all of my 16 months that I spent at Fort Carson. And so it was just kind of a time of my life that I responded as, a young man, because I was 24 when I was drafted. But it just kind of interrupted my life plan, and I went and served, and then as soon as I got out, I picked my life back up and moved on. And I really cherish the few pictures that I do have. I have, I think maybe 6 pictures of me on a bivouac during basic training. And, of course, I have my one Army picture that the Army takes of you when I think we were getting out of basic training. I have that and about 6 pictures of in the field bivouac pictures is all I have. I still have my Army uniform now, but I did not make any lifelong friends that I've kept in contact with.
Well, at least you can cherish the very few pictures you have.
I do.
I'm gonna finish up with a couple follow-up questions. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but did you continue to live in Colorado Springs after your term ended? I know that you moved states. Just what's a little bit more detail about that?
When I got out of the service, we stayed in Colorado Springs until June of 1975. So I stayed for 3.5 years. I taught at Harrison at Gorman Junior High in the Harrison District here on the southern edge of Colorado Springs. My wife Nettie worked at Bill Brett Dodge out on, I think, Highway 24 or whatever. She worked at a Dodge dealership as a service manager secretary. And we really enjoyed. We bought a home in Whitefield and kind of settled down. But my wife's an only child. Her parents lived in Flint, Michigan, Grand Blanc, Michigan. And she got homesick after 3 years away from Michigan. And so we moved back to Flint. And I resumed my teaching in Michigan. And so we did stay in Colorado Springs for 3.5 years after I got out of the service.
You said you married your sweetheart. Did you have any children?
We adopted one daughter, and she is now 40 years old, and she is a radiologist.
All right, and what has your life been like after the whole war has ended? What are some major key points or anything?
Well, I spent it in public education. I was a math teacher there at Gorman. I came back to Michigan, found a job as a math teacher. Went and got my master's degree in educational leadership. Went and got my specialist in leadership. And my doctorate work was in educational leadership. Became a high school principal. Spent 20 years as a high school principal. So I had taught 9. Was in the military. They gave me credit for 2 years in the military and 20 years as a principal. So I had 31 years in public education. Retired here in Michigan, and then I went and taught at the college level for 16 years. So after the military and after the war, I spent my entire career in education and had a fabulous career. And I've had a good life. We've been extremely blessed, and I guess according to most standards, we've done pretty well.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. Well, I am done with all the questions I have. Is there anything else that you want to say, or did you touch it all?
Nicole, I think I've just about covered my 18 months in the military and my subsequent 40-plus years since then.
That's awesome.
I've had a good life, though.
That's awesome. Well, I'm going to turn off the recorder now.